The following episode contains difficult subject matter, including references to suicide. Please take care.
They told their followers that this is the first time that people are going to be able to do this, to ascend like this, since Jesus. And I don't think that most people believed that they were going to commit suicide. But you can't say that there wasn't some level of apocalyptic thought baked into the organization early on.
I'm Kathleen Goldhar. This is Crime Story. There is always curiosity around cults. Why do people join and why do they stay? It's something that I spent a lot of time thinking about when I produced the podcast Escaping NXIVM, about the dangerous cult and its leader Keith Raniere. But as somebody who's never actually joined a cult, I could only go so far. That wasn't the case for Glynn Washington, because Glynn grew up in a cult. And when he heard about the 39 members of a group called Heaven's Gate committing mass suicide, he knew that he could dive into the story like no one else. The result of his investigation is a podcast called Heaven's Gate. Heaven's Gate was founded by two people, a woman named Bonnie Nettles and a man named Marshall Applewhite in the early 1970s. And over time, they became known as T and Doe, and they claimed to be prophets who could lead followers into the afterlife. But first, you had to give up your life here on Earth. Glynn says that he understood T and Doe's power, and he also understood why members made that final, awful decision. Glynn, welcome to Crime Story.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with Heaven's Gate, and then we'll get into how your story sort of either dovetails or, we can compare your background to this cult. But tell me about Heaven's Gate. Who were they?
Heaven's Gate, who they were a group of seekers. I just, to back up a little bit, I think that oftentimes we have this idea of, these culty, crazy people who go off and do wild and wacky things. And I have found that more often than not, that people who are part of these organizations that are oftentimes preaching and talking about radical change, talking about self-worth, talking about a different way, they're oftentimes in so many ways the best of us. The people who really want to do better by themselves, who really want to do good for the world, who see the things that are broken and are trying to fix it. And the people who are in this group, and I got to meet them through what they left behind, through who they left behind. And I think every time it's like these were bright, smart, caring, empathetic people who got taken for a ride. And really, I think I want the whole thing leave a lesson for us, but what a warning and what a tragedy.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that. Like I said, with Escaping NXIVM, we got to talk to people who had left, and I think the hardest part for them often was some of the stuff that they learned, some of the teachings and some of the ways in which they walk through the world. They weren't all bad, and they came from a place of trying to be good. And it was very confusing and complicated for them to figure out what to take from that and what to leave behind because of the bad stuff that happened. So I hear what you're saying. But tell me what it was that people were joining when they joined Heaven's Gate. What kind of messaging? What was Heaven's Gate saying they had the answers to?
Well, Heaven's Gate claimed to have the answer for a lot of different things, and it was
as cults do.
Yeah, they had the answer for a lot of different things, and it was the belief system came from a lot of different places as well. There was some good Old Testament. There was a lot of New Testament. The Book of Revelation was very, very big in the Heaven's Gate sort of theology. But for everything from crop circles to the Egyptian pyramids seemed to have found their way. It was ravenous theology, in that it could take a lot of different things. but really was trying to say that, T and Do.
And T and Do were the leaders.
Yes, they were the leaders. Basically, that in the book of Revelations, it mentions two witnesses that would come forth and with power and the authority of the Creator and lead people to a new understanding. And the two leaders, and eventually the one, Applewhite, saw himself as a modern day apostle that were going to lead a flock to the next land. Only, I don't think that the New Testament, book of Revelations, mentioned anything about outer space. That was an addition that Heaven's Gate put on the whole situation. That was their spin on it.
So Heaven's Gate was founded in the early 70s, correct?
Yes.
And what was life like at the beginning with the two leaders, T and Do? Like what kind of life did these people live with them?
Well, to large degree, it was an itinerant monastic life. T and Do didn't have any great resources or any grand cathedral anywhere. They would ask their potential followers to give up everything they have and to go and follow them. And that's a hard sell. And T and Do themselves, they started off leaving their own families, leaving children behind. And once they saw each other, then they wandered. They were convinced that they were linked to each other cosmically and spiritually. And they abandoned everything else they had to search for what this link and this energy was about until they finally got a follower. And this was a big deal, getting that first follower. Now, they didn't, they're saying to the followers, they're telling people, look, this life is temporary. This is going to be hard now, but you're looking for a greater reward in this next life. Again, this is a hard sell, that you're going to work and maybe live in tents or in campers, doing God knows what, with no immediate reward. I think it's one of those things where I hate to say this term, but you had to be there. I think the magnetism is not so much in the message, but the magnetism with the people who were saying this message. And T and Do, the founders of this group, had a real magnetism, and they were able to get people to do some things that you would think that they would not.
So obviously the last thing was the mass suicide, but were there other things that they got them to do that were something that their charisma was able to do? First of all, giving up everything that you have, going off and joining a group. But then, you discover that, some of them have, in fact, castrated themselves. Mm-hmm. They would emulate T and Do's pattern of speech, their clothing, their message. They saw T and Do as a earthly manifestation of a cosmic being, and they were trying to emulate that cosmic being. They like I said, when you go so far as to potentially castrate yourself, mm-hmm. You haven't. That's a strong pull.
You have, yeah. That's a pull. You're on a different. It's not casual. The relationship.
The understatement.
The relationship is not casual. They are really serious about what they're doing here.
So can we talk a little bit about T and Do? Tell me about T first. Let's go there. Who was she?
So Bonnie Nettles, T, she was in fact the real spiritual powerhouse behind what became Heaven's Gate. And she was born in the late 20s to a big Baptist family. She was a nurse, and they lived in Texas, and she had 4 kids. I don't get anything from her early background that would lead you to think that she was someone who was about to start a international religious organization. And she met Applewhite in 1972. I believe they met at a hospital. Supposedly, Applewhite went to the hospital to visit a friend. Some people say actually that he went there for some sort of mental treatment. But they instantly, from all accounts, became enamored with each other. Perhaps not sexually, but they saw themselves as being linked. She was a astrologer, a seer, and she foretold that their fates were intertwined. And that's kind of the beginning. That's the origin story of Heaven's Gate.
And your insight into a group like this is informed in a way that a lot of us aren't. And it's because of how you grew up and your parents' shift to becoming part of a group like this. So can you tell us a bit about where, like when you started looking into Heaven's Gate, where you found yourself understanding the draw? Or at least understanding,
I mentioned seeing on the TV with a group of people, the initial footage of the tragedy of the mass suicide. And they're all wearing tracksuits. They've got these shoes on, and more things were coming out. And there's helicopters were circling the building, and everyone around me was like, "Wow, look at those crazies! Look at those! That's insane! That's this! That's the other." And I kept thinking, I could see that if a couple extra left turns had been made, I could see the organization I grew up in being in a mass suicide in some other mansion somewhere. And I grew up in a group that was called the Worldwide Church of God. And it was led by a former ad man by the name of Herbert W. Armstrong, who started in the 30s talking about, the church was then called the Radio Church of God. And he used a lot of the same scriptures and things pulled from the Bible to say this is the end time. That, in fact, that I have a special key to unlocking the book of Revelations in very much the same way that T and Doe did for the Heaven's Gate organization. And that, I grew up in a group where people thought that the end time was coming any moment. Some people, in fact, took to wearing their boots to bed so that they would be ready in a moment's notice in case Jesus showed up.
Wow.
And yeah, and when you're in that kind of an organization, and it's not like the end time is going to come someday, that your reward will be in some eventual heaven. No, you're talking about next week. You're talking about right now. The immediacy of this could happen any moment creates an intensity amongst the community that is hard to even understand or talk about if you're outside of it. That we are doing this stuff right now because we know we have a secret. We were chosen, special. I grew up basically thinking that I was Harry Potter and everyone else was a Muggle. And I can see, very much the same thing here, where you saw people basically cutting off their families, saying that T and Doe were their new mothers and fathers. All of these things that they were doing here that seem so wacky and so weird are things that I saw growing up. We were cut off from our families and things of this nature.
To me, there is a terrifying nature to the end of the world. But to you, growing up in that, was there an excitement to that then? It wasn't a terrifying thought?
Oh, there's an excitement and a terrifying thought. The terrifying thing is that even amongst the group, some of you might not make it. That means that, and just like with Heaven's Gate, not everyone's going to get to go. So you're competing. Now you've been chosen. You're part of the group, but you might not be. You might be left behind unless you don't get in line with the leader's admonitions. That creates within a group, of any type of group, this competition. I'm going to out essentially Heaven's Gate, the other Heaven's Gators, to make sure that I'm first in line for this eventual reward. You're going to make sure that once the big turn comes, whether it's getting on a spaceship or meeting Jesus, that you're going to be in that line to ready to go.
What did Heaven's Gate believe the end of the world would look like?
They didn't believe this all the time, but they came to believe that the world was going to end and that they were going to have one last chance to evacuate this earth. And that was going to come with the approach of the Hale-Bopp comet. And that for reasons I never quite understood, that they understood that there was a spacecraft that was trailing that comet and that they were going to rendezvous with that spacecraft, but that was not going to be a straight physical meeting, that they were going to leave their bodies behind, but their beings would be taken up to this craft. That's what they were preparing to do.
And is that why they had to commit suicide to join that? Did they have to be not of this earth to join?
Yeah. They were going to ascend. And, we're trying to put the logic of words on, which was a very illogical belief system. But they did. They believed that they were going to have a final exit and that they would ascend to the spacecraft, and that after them, that the earth was going to be doomed. And they made that happen. And I will say this as well. We don't know everything what happened with that group in the final few months, but it seems like Applewhite was sick. By this point, his partner, Nettles, had already passed away. He was depressed. And I mean, I guess I understand it. I guess in the most horrible way possible, a dying man took his followers with him. When I look at what happened, someone who was already probably nearing the end of their own life, someone who had lost their life partner, then decided that the best way to go was to take their followers with them both.
So when Heaven's Gate began and it was T and Do together, there was a end of the world belief, but the suicide, the mass exodus wasn't part of that to begin with.
I don't think that the suicide mass exodus became part of it until very near the end. Even the comet itself, that seemed to be a fairly late addition to their theology, which is not particularly, these groups evolve and change, and depending upon the whims of their leaders. And I think that a lot of that happened. They certainly believed that they were extraterrestrial. They thought that Jesus was an extraterrestrial. And I should say that as well. They thought that Jesus was an extraterrestrial who came to Earth, who was killed, and then whose body rose from the dead and then was taken to a spaceship. And they told their followers that this is the first time that people are going to be able to do this, to ascend like this, since Jesus. And I don't think that most people believed that they were going to commit suicide. But you can't say that there wasn't some level of apocalyptic thought baked into the organization early on.
Were there survivors of the mass suicide?
Yeah, there sure were. People who, for whatever reason, weren't there, didn't take the thing, hid in the restroom, and some that were featured on the show seemed to regret not being there, and have gone on to maintain the beliefs of the organization, to run websites about the organization, espousing the organization. And a lot of people were in and out of the group that eventually did kill themselves. People who had left fairly recently and came back with wondering if they'd missed their shot, wondering if they missed their chance to go and get on the spaceship.
So you spoke to those people, and it really was fascinating that they, all this time later, still sort of feel connected. Do you understand that? Do you know where they were coming from, what that was about?
Do I understand it? I understand the seriousness of that. I am from Middle America. I'm from Michigan, and where there are, it's a huge evangelical community. And I know a few years ago, to kind of espouse their belief system, people started leaving sets of clothes and things on the front lawns to kind of recreate what it's going to look like for when the rapture comes. That people are going to be whisked away in a Christian rapture, and they're going to just leave their clothes behind on wherever they happen to be, and that you better get ready right now. And there are all sorts of movies and documentaries and books. In fact, a huge series called Left Behind about what it was going to be like when that happens. What's going to be like to be left behind. These are books that sold millions of copies. There are movies that had millions of viewers. And so in a way, the remnant of the Heaven's Gate community, a lot of them feel like a real life Left Behind situation happened to them, that their leaders have been essentially, let's just say, use the term raptured away, and that because they didn't stay next to their leader the way they thought they should, that they missed their shot, and that they feel culpable and sad that their belief wasn't strong enough to let them get on the spaceship before it took off.
Wow. You also talked to T's daughter in this podcast, and it's really quite hard to listen to her. I mean, talk about being left behind. She also feels like her mother left her behind.
Yeah. And her mother did leave her behind.
Yeah.
Her mother decided that that she had something else to do. And she loved her mother. That this was not a casual thing to have your mother decide, I'm going to go off with some strange man because the universe is calling me to do so, and I'll see you when I see you. That left scars. That was painful to talk about, and to still see after that abandonment, the love that she obviously had. It was, we are unknowable creatures. That's all I can say about that.
The other person that I felt so sad for was there was a mother of one of the guys that did die who has memories and videos of the one time that her son, I think his name was Steve, right, who came home and had a couple of days with his parents.
There was Steve, there was another woman. These people were loved, who went off and did this unfathomable thing. They were loved. And that loss is, when you talk to the parents, it is right there at the kitchen table. And these are people who live in regular communities, who, go to maybe go to church on Sunday, maybe don't, who have regular jobs, who clean garages and barbecue on Saturdays. These are people who are regular folk that had their entire lives torn apart, and they talk about their children, and you see that same thing. They were seekers, they were dreamers, they were people who wanted better, who wanted racial harmony and wanted environmental justice and wanted to give. And you see that the organization preyed on the best of us and the families left behind. Oh, it was just universally the sweetest people you could possibly meet were the mothers and fathers of some of the young people who went off with Heaven's Gate.
Is that what sticks with you mostly when you sort of think back to the work you did on this?
It is. It's sitting at those tables and the generosity of having a stranger come into your house and pick at your worst scab, at the thing that hurts you the most. And you do this because you don't want this to happen to someone else's child. You want to tell your story if it gives anyone even a glimpse of a direction of being able to save their children because you've already lost yours.
And they tried, one of the things that I found interesting was that they were sort of educated on how to speak to their kids because they wanted them to leave. They had a feeling that they were in a cult, but they were careful. They had gotten some advice, right, from cult experts and people who were trying to, who wanted them to leave. And so can you tell us a little bit about that, like just how hard it was for them to sit back, seeing their child be controlled this way, wanting to, as a parent too, I can understand the feeling that you just want to rip them away and throw them in a trunk somewhere and wait it out. But yeah, that must have been so hard for the parents.
Yeah, there was a big, schism, in fact, about doing just that. Near the end, Applewhite was basically saying, don't come try to kidnap your kids away. And you had experts trying to talk to the parents. And how do you not scare these people away? You don't want to come after and say, oh, you're in a cult. You're in this, you're in that. You're trying to find what are the terms that I can use that can maybe get them home for a visit, that can maybe let them see their little sister again. You're trying your best to not disparage the group that they're in, but show them a little bit about what's on the other side waiting for them if they could put this down for a while. And it's almost like you feel like you have to have been trained in hostage negotiation, because in a lot of ways that's exactly what this was. And you don't necessarily understand what your kid is even up to, what led them to join this weird guy in the middle of the woods somewhere. It is an ultimate nightmare on behalf of the families and these mothers and fathers.
For sure, because obviously the worst case scenario came true. What about you? Tell me how you exited the group.
Yeah, I in my my late teens, I was a true believer. Like I said,
you were a true believer.
I was a true believer, and I thought it had some issues, but I thought that we were doing the right thing and had the overall framework was correct. And then, like a lot of teenagers do in their late teens, they start looking around, start reading some things, start questioning some things. And to his credit, my pastor, I was asking him, where did this Bible thing come from? And he gave me a book, and it was called Who Wrote the Bible? And I read it. I read it again, and I was pretty much done. And when I say pretty much done, this is the group I had been grown up in. This is the group that my parents and my siblings were in. And it was a group that I was just conditioned essentially from birth to believe had some key to the universe. And so walking away from it, even though I knew that's what I had to do, to some degree, I expected, fire to rain down from the sky and the earth to shake when I didn't go along with it. In fact, I tried to make it easier on myself, and eventually I actually moved to Japan. Yeah, I moved away. I thought that I'd get on the other side of the globe. And let me just tell you what happened, because this is not uncommon, I found out, with organizations of this type. I went to an apartment in a town that I had never been to before. I was going to start a school. It was brand new. If someone asked me
in Japan.
If someone asked me my address, I didn't know it. I didn't know my phone number. I didn't know how to use the phone in Japan at the time. And I'm walking into my new apartment for the first time in a town I'd never heard of, never been to before, and the phone is ringing. And I thought, oh, this will be funny. I'll answer this phone and give somebody a good little chuckle with this weird foreign voice. I pick it up and said, is this Glynn Washington? Yeah. Well, this is so-and-so from the church, and we heard you in Japan right now. I just wanted to know if you want someone to come down and get you to come to meetings. And I had to give him one of those, make some static and hang up the phone. But they knew where I was before my mama did. They knew where I was before I knew where I was.
Wow.
And and this is way before AI and modern tracking and the internet and all that kind of stuff. They have their finger on their followers in a really intimate way. Imagine an organization like that, and give them modern powers. Give them access to your phone. Give them access to your internet, your house, your computer. Their spouse is in the organization along with the children, and you start to understand the types of control that these organizations can have over someone.
What was inside you that gave you the strength to, one, pretend there was static on the line and hang up, and then stick through it? Because it wouldn't have been over then. I mean, I'm assuming that the emotional ties would have been pretty hard to...
Yeah, the emotional ties, and very similar here, that's if you leave, there's a type of excommunication, that you don't get to talk to the people that you grew up with anymore, that those people who are dear to you, who've become your new family, you are cut off from them. And that is, even if those, even if that's your mother, your father, to some extent, that's really, really, really tough. But you get to the point, at least I know I did, where I can't do this anymore. You didn't
believe anymore.
I didn't believe. And then I was so lucky to go to Japan, because I didn't speak Japanese when I first got there. And so as I learned the language, you're like a child again. You're like, I'm like a preschooler and a kindergartner of my level of my language. And then I have to try and tell someone what I believe in my basic Japanese. And I hear the words coming out of my mouth in a very different way. Like, what did I just say? Do I believe that? That's crazy. And
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I got a different lens. I will be forever grateful. And even after I stopped, like, necessarily believing in the church, it's like you can take the boy out of the cult, but it's really, really hard to take the cult out of the boy. It took me years. In fact, a lot of my friends will say I have never accomplished completely eradicating a lot of that cult stuff from, who I am. And now to this point, not to say that I would necessarily want to, because as you mentioned earlier, from NXIVM, like some of the things, they're either in too deep to who I am, or I find them to be beneficial, even though they're the fruit of the poisonous tree. And I'm sure I know that's the way a lot of people from Heaven's Gate feel about it. I know, like, for myself, we were taught that we were special, that we alone were chosen to have this special knowledge by the Lord of the universe. I grew up thinking that I was chosen and select. Now, I know that's absurd now, but sometimes I still feel special. is that that's the truth.
Well, I don't want to say you're not, but I hear
I'm a special boy. I'm specially chosen.
What about your family? Are you reconnected? Like, how did it all sort of play out with your parents and your siblings?
Oh, it's still, the ramifications of this are still playing out. What happened in the late 80s, the founder of our organization passed away. And since that happened, the organization tore itself asunder. There are literally over 800 different splinter groups from the organization I grew up in. And
wow.
Both of my parents are out of the organization, but they've joined new ones. It's been such a burden for our family, even now. Even like when I say now, I mean of this weekend, the arguments over what people think their God wants them to do, what their God is saying to them. And it's really hard. It's really hard to maintain relationships with people that you love when this is so central to everything. But we all do things that might not be at its face logical. All belief systems, all religions are inherently on their face. They are anti-logical. They are anti-scientific. The idea on its face that there is a UFO behind the Hale-Bopp comet is not any scientifically less or more valid than, turning water into blood. But one is more generally acceptable, and one is an outlier. And so I say that to say we're used to dealing with conversations, with beliefs that hold ideas that are outside the idea of rational scientific discourse. And if you can get with me that far, if you can hang with me that far, it's not too much greater a leap to think that somebody who is seeking a new world, they could make a step into an organization that is as extreme as this without being a twisted person.
For sure. It's very, I agree and understand with what you're saying. Lastly, you went into this podcast with an inherent understanding, like you said, of why people would join a group like this. That you didn't start with the idea that they were crazy or stupid. You had an inherent sense of that. Was there anything that surprised you or impacted you in a way that you didn't expect as you were putting this together?
Yeah. There's video of the people who went on to commit suicide right before they did it. I think the last few days. And you see smiles on their faces. You see them kind of joking around with each other. They look normal, like a bunch of people who know each other really, really well, who have found their community. And if you were to look at it and not know what happens next, you would say, boy, I wish I had a bunch of friends like that. That was chilling and hard to see. And I think it was surprising to me. I don't know that, like you said, I wasn't expecting monsters. I wasn't expecting that at all. But the normalcy that I saw with the people, I don't think I was expecting that either.
It is, even just hearing the voices, which I did on the podcast, it's very disconcerting.
Yeah.
Well, Glynn, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to speak to me, and thanks for your work.
Thank you so much for listening to it. I think if you haven't heard the series, check it out. There is also an HBO series that was made that used the podcast as a springboard called Heaven Sketches as well.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, congrats on that too, and thank you.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Crime Story from CBC Podcasts. We drop a new episode every Monday. You can get our next episode a week early on CBC Podcast's YouTube channel or by subscribing to the CBC Podcast True Crime channel on Apple Podcasts. In addition to early access, subscribers to our True Crime channel also listen ad-free. Crime Story is written and hosted by me. Our producers are Alexis Green and Sarah Clayton. Sound design by Graham McDonald. Our senior producer is Jeff Turner. Our video producer is Evan Agard. Our YouTube producer is John Lee. Executive producers are Cecil Fernandez and Chris Oak. Tanya Springer is CBC Podcast Senior Manager, and Arif Noorani is the Director of CBC Podcasts.